The oppressive afternoon sun beat down on Rodeo Drive, turning the polished hoods of 1,000 luxury cars into blinding mirrors. The air, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and exhaust fumes, hung heavy and stagnant, mirroring the gridlock traffic that had brought the heart of Beverly Hills to a complete standstill. This was a place where time was money, and right now, time was frozen. The low, guttural hum of powerful engines was a symphony of impatience, a collective growl from the world's most privileged, trapped in their leather and chrome cages. On the pristine sidewalks, past the indifferent gazes of mannequins in Gucci and Prada storefronts, a raw human drama was unfolding, a stark and brutal contrast to the untouchable wealth that surrounded it, a crisis that money, for once, was powerless to solve. Inside the cool, silent cabin of his chauffeured Rolls-Royce, Julian Croft felt a vain throb in his temple. At 42, he was the sculpted embodiment of Hollywood perfection, an action star whose on-screen invincibility had earned him hundreds of millions. He was wearing a Tom Ford suit that cost more than the average car, its sharp lines a perfect container for his chiseled physique. His jaw was clenched, a mask of cold fury barely concealed behind a pair of $1,200 sunglasses. He was late, catastrophically late, for a meeting that would secure his next franchise, and his world, built on precision and control, was being derailed by this mundane inconvenience. He was a hero to millions, a savior on the silver screen, but in the sterile reality of his own life, he was an island of profound isolation, his heart a hollow echo chamber of fame. His patience, a notoriously finite resource, finally snapped. With a sharp, angry gesture, he pushed the door open, stepping out into the suffocating heat. The sudden noise and glare of the outside world assaulted him. He stormed past the line of cars, his expensive shoes slapping against the hot pavement, his eyes fixed on the source of the commotion ahead. He saw a police officer, a man in his late 40s, down on his knees in the middle of the chaos. Assuming the worst a power-tripping cop, enjoying a moment of authority, Julian's frustration boiled over into a torrent of pure arrogance. He closed the distance, his shadow falling over the kneeling officer, his voice cutting through the air like a whip, dripping with the self-importance that had become his armor. "What the hell is this? You're blocking the entire street for a traffic stop. Do you know who I am?" He bellowed, the words designed to intimidate, to clear a path through sheer force of will. But Officer Miller didn't even flinch, his focus absolute. It was only when Julian pushed forward, ready to unleash another tirade, that his world tilted on its axis. He saw it then. The officer wasn't writing a ticket. He was performing desperate, rhythmic chest compressions on the small, still body of an 8-year-old girl lying on the sidewalk. A wave of hysterical, grief-stricken sobs from a woman nearby finally pierced his rage, replacing it with a sudden, bone-deep horror. The chasm between his petty annoyance and the life-or-death struggle before him ripped his reality apart. If you're just finding this story, take a moment to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from in the world. We love seeing how far these stories travel. A profound, chilling silence descended upon Julian, a vacuum where the arrogant fury had been moments before. The frantic sounds of Rodeo Drive, the car horns, the distant sirens faded into a dull, meaningless hum. All he could hear was the ragged, desperate sound of Officer Miller's breathing and the heart-wrenching sobs of Maya's mother, each cry a physical blow. He stood frozen, a statue of tailored irrelevance, his multi-million-dollar persona utterly useless in the face of this raw, terrifying reality. The man he played in movies would have known what to do, would have swept in and saved the day. But Julian Croft, the man, was just a spectator to real heroism, and the realization left him feeling hollowed out, a fraud in his own life. The piercing shriek of an approaching ambulance finally broke his paralysis. Paramedics moved with a practiced, urgent grace, their presence a whirlwind of controlled chaos that pushed the crowd back. They surrounded Maya, their voices calm and professional as they took over from the exhausted officer. Julian watched, mesmerized by their efficiency, by their complete focus on the fragile life in their hands. He was an obstacle, a piece of the scenery to be worked around. Every question they asked, every piece of equipment they prepared, underscored his own powerlessness. He who commanded film sets and held audiences captive was nothing more than a gawking bystander, his presence an intrusion on a sacred, terrible moment. As they carefully lifted Maya onto a gurney and began wheeling her toward the ambulance, a small pink sneaker, its laces undone, slipped from her foot and fell to the pavement. It lay there on the grimy concrete, a tiny, poignant symbol of interrupted childhood, starkly out of place amidst the glittering luxury of the street. The sight of it, so small and ordinary, struck Julian with the force of a physical impact. It was more real than any script, more potent than any award. It was a tangible piece of the life that was hanging in the balance, a life he had been actively inconveniencing just moments earlier. The shame was a fire in his gut, burning away the last of his indignation. In a move that seemed to surprise himself as much as his bewildered driver watching from the curb, Julian bent down. His knees, clad in expensive wool, touched the sidewalk as he reached out and picked up the tiny shoe. It felt impossibly light in his large, manicured hand, its worn sole and scuffed toe telling a story of playgrounds and scraped knees. This small object became an anchor, a connection to the reality he had so violently crashed into. He straightened up, clutching the sneaker as if it were a lifeline, his mind made up. The meeting, the franchise, the carefully constructed edifice of his career, it all evaporated, turning to dust in the face of this one overwhelming reality. He strode back to his car, his face a mask of grim determination that his driver had never seen before. He slid into the plush leather seat, the door closing with a soft thud that sealed him off from the world again, but now he was a different man inside it. He held up the sneaker. "Follow that ambulance," he commanded, his voice raspy, stripped of its usual commanding tone and replaced with something raw and urgent. The driver, accustomed to destinations like five-star restaurants and private jet terminals, hesitated for a fraction of a second, his confusion plain on his face. "Sir, your meeting," he began, but Julian cut him off with a look of such intensity that the words died in his throat. "Now," Julian said. The journey to the hospital was a blur of motion and sound, a silent, tense pursuit through the arteries of a city that suddenly felt alien to him. Julian stared down at the sneaker in his hands, turning it over and over. The simple object seemed to magnify his own failings. He saw the life he had built, a life of catered meals, fawning assistants, and manufactured drama as a hollow shell. He had mistaken comfort for happiness, admiration for love. The frayed lace of the shoe felt more substantial than any of his possessions. Each block they covered, each red light the driver cautiously ran, felt like a race against his own past, a desperate attempt to outrun the ghost of his own profound selfishness. They arrived at the emergency entrance of Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in a spray of gravel, the sleek black car looking absurdly out of place amongst the ambulances and frantic family members. The air here was thick with a different kind of tension, not the impatience of the wealthy, but the sharp, metallic tang of fear and antiseptic. Julian leaped from the car before it had even come to a complete stop, the sneaker still clutched in his hand, and ran toward the automatic doors that had swallowed the gurney whole. He was driven by a primal, irrational need to stay connected to this crisis, as if his presence alone could somehow atone for his earlier transgression. He pushed through the doors into the bright, chaotic triage area, but a security guard immediately intercepted him, a firm hand on his arm. "Sir, you can't go back there. Family only," the guard said, his voice polite but unyielding. For the first time in over a decade, Julian's fame was not a key but a lock. His recognizable face, usually a passport to any world he wished to enter, was now just a distraction. He tried to explain, to stammer something about the girl, but he was just another person in the way, another piece of the unfolding chaos. He was gently but firmly guided toward a waiting area, leaving him to stand alone under the harsh fluorescent lights, utterly helpless. He eventually found his way to the pediatric ICU waiting room, a sterile, beige space designed for quiet desperation. The air was still and smelled faintly of bleach. A television mounted in the corner, played a silent news broadcast. The chairs were hard plastic, arranged in unforgiving rows. It was a place where time stretched and warped, where every tick of the clock was a lifetime. Julian felt like an alien who had landed on a hostile planet. His expensive suit felt like a costume, his confidence a distant memory. This room was a crucible of real human emotion, and he had come into it utterly unprepared, armed with nothing but a profound and growing sense of his own inadequacy. Across the room, he saw them, a man and a woman huddled together, their bodies a portrait of shared grief. The woman, Maria, was weeping silently into her hands, while the man, David, stared blankly at the wall, his arm wrapped tightly around her. They were Maya's parents. Their clothes were simple, worn, but clean jeans and T-shirts that screamed their otherness in Julian's world of curated perfection. Their faces were etched with a terror so profound that Julian had to look away. He saw in them a reflection of a pain he had long ago buried, a pain he had used his fame and fortune to build a wall around. He walked toward them, his steps hesitant on the polished linoleum floor. The confidence he projected on screen was gone, replaced by a clumsy, awkward uncertainty. What could he possibly say? "I'm sorry for your daughter, and also for being the world's biggest fool on the side of the road." He held out the small pink sneaker, the gesture feeling both intimate and presumptuous. This fell off," he managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. The words felt pathetic, a completely inadequate offering in the face of their monumental fear and grief. He felt the weight of their judgment, the silent question of why this famous stranger was intruding on their private nightmare. Maria looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen. When she saw the sneaker, a fresh wave of grief washed over her, a ragged sob escaping her lips. She took it from Julian's hand, her fingers closing around it as if it were the most precious object in the world. She pressed it to her chest, rocking back and forth. David, however, looked at Julian with an expression of pure, unadulterated suspicion. His eyes, full of pain and anger, scanned Julian from head to toe, taking in the expensive suit and the famous face, and saw not a concerned citizen, but an invader, a tourist in their tragedy whose reasons for being there could not possibly be pure. Seeing Maria clutch the shoe sent a jolt through Julian's memory, a shock that bypassed 2 decades of carefully constructed emotional barriers. It wasn't just a shoe. It was a totem, a link to a lost child. Suddenly, he wasn't in a Los Angeles hospital in 2025. He was 20 years younger, standing in the cold, sterile hallway of a different hospital, clutching a small, stuffed bunny with one ear missing. It had belonged to his sister Sarah. The memory, so violently repressed for so long, came roaring back with the force of a physical assault, leaving him breathless and dizzy with a guilt he thought he had outrun. He remembered the phone call with perfect, tortuous clarity. He had been in his trailer on the set of his first blockbuster film, high on the intoxicating fumes of his own burgeoning fame. His mother's voice had been tight with worry on the other end of the line. "Julian, it's Sarah. Her fever is worse. The doctors don't know what it is." He had waved it off, his mind already on the premiere that night, on the red carpet and the flashing cameras. "It's just the flu, Mom. She'll be fine." "I have to go. I'm late," he had said, his impatience a casual cruelty he wouldn't recognize until it was too late. That night was supposed to be the greatest of his life. He had stepped onto the red carpet, a king in his new kingdom, the blinding flash of cameras his adoring subjects. The world was at his feet. He felt invincible, immortal. He basked in the applause, in the fawning questions from reporters. His phone buzzed in his pocket once, then twice. He ignored it. It was probably his agent with more good news, and he was too busy soaking in his own glory. The second call he missed was from the hospital. That was the call, he would later learn, where they had asked his mother for permission to take heroic measures. The third call was the one he finally answered. It came from his father, his voice a broken thing Julian had never heard before. The world of flashing lights and fake smiles dissolved around him. The sounds of the premiere became a muffled roar. All he could hear was the terrible, simple truth: Sarah was gone. A sudden, aggressive meningitis that had been misdiagnosed as the flu. While he had been celebrating his fictional heroism, his real family had been losing the most important battle of their lives. The guilt was instantaneous and absolute, a poison that seeped into his soul and had remained there ever since. Back in the waiting room at Cedars-Sinai, that same toxic guilt filled his lungs, making it hard to breathe. He looked at Maya's parents, at their raw and filtered anguish, and he saw his own mother and father. He saw the life he had chosen, a life of chasing ghosts on a screen while running from the real ones in his heart. He had convinced himself that the money and fame were a way to protect himself from ever feeling that helpless again, but it was all a lie. He was just as helpless now as he was then, a terrified boy hiding inside the body of a world-famous man. A nurse with a kind but weary face emerged from the ICU doors, her footsteps soft on the floor. "Mr. and Mrs. Flores?" she asked gently. Maria and David leaped to their feet, their faces a mixture of hope and dread. "She's stable for now," the nurse said, offering a small, practiced smile. "The doctors are running more tests. We're doing everything we can." The words were meant to be comforting, a standard hospital platitude, but to Julian, they sounded like a death sentence. They were the same empty words he had heard all those years ago, a prelude to the final, devastating silence. Driven by a desperate, panicked need to do something, to fix this, Julian stepped forward again. He fell back on the only tool he knew, the one that had solved every problem in his adult life: money. "Listen," he said, his voice still loud in the quiet room. "I want to help. I can get you the best doctors, fly them in from anywhere. Whatever it costs, it doesn't matter. Just let me handle it." The offer was genuine, born of a frantic desire to rewrite his own history, to succeed where he had failed before. But the words came out all wrong, tainted by the arrogance he hadn't yet learned to shed. David turned to him, his eyes blazing with a quiet, dignified fury. "My daughter is not a business deal, Mr. Croft," he said, his voice low and steady, each word a carefully aimed dart. "She is not a problem for you to solve with your checkbook, so you can feel better about yourself. We don't want your money." The rejection was absolute. A door slammed shut in his face. It stung Julian more than any scathing film review or public scandal ever had. It was a rejection not of his wealth, but of his very essence, of the man he had become. It told him that in this place, he was worth nothing. Utterly ashamed, Julian retreated to a chair in the far corner of the room, the space around him feeling cold and vast. He felt like an intruder, a voyeur who had stumbled into a sacred ceremony of grief. He watched Maria and David as they spoke to each other in low, hushed tones, their hands clasped together, their shared history, and love a fortress he could never penetrate. He had bodyguards, an agent, a publicist, an army of people paid to be in his life, but he had no one to hold his hand in the dark. The profound depth of his own solitude had never been more apparent. The hours bled into one another, marked only by the changing shifts of the nursing staff and the slow crawl of the clock on the wall. The hospital had its own rhythm, a constant, low-grade hum of beeping machines, soft soled shoes on linoleum, and hushed conversations behind closed doors. It was a self-contained universe fueled by pain, hope, and disinfectant. For Julian, it was a purgatory where he was forced to confront the man he had become, stripped of all his usual distractions. There were no scripts to memorize, no workouts to complete, no interviews to give. There was only the silence and the guilt. Sometime in the middle of the night, it occurred to him that he had completely forgotten about the multi-million-dollar studio meeting, the fate of his next blockbuster franchise, a matter that had seemed life or death just that afternoon, now felt absurdly trivial. He hadn't called his agent. He hadn't checked his emails. For the first time in his adult life, his career was not the center of his universe. A small, almost imperceptible crack had formed in the armor of his self-absorption, and through it, a terrifying and unfamiliar light was beginning to shine through. Just as that thought crossed his mind, his phone, which he had silenced, began to vibrate violently against the plastic arm of the chair. He glanced at the screen. It was a maelstrom of notifications. 117 missed calls, 342 text messages, a cascade of news alerts, each one featuring his name. His carefully managed world was in the process of imploding, and he hadn't even noticed. The bubble of his fame had finally burst, and the real world was rushing in to fill the void with a vengeance. His finger hovered over the screen, a sense of dread washing over him. The calls were mostly from his agent, Robert, and his publicist, Claire. Their text messages were a frantic stream of capital letters and exclamation points. "Julian, call me. Emergency. They have video. Where are you?" This is a catastrophe. He felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He knew what they were talking about. He had been so consumed by Maya and his own past that he had forgotten about the audience, the ever-present eye of the public that had built his career and could just as easily tear it down. With a trembling finger, he tapped on a news notification from a major entertainment outlet. The headline was brutal, designed for maximum clicks and outrage. Hero complex. Arrogant actor Julian Croft berates officer saving child's life. Beneath it was a screenshot of his face, twisted in a mask of ugly, privileged anger. He felt a wave of nausea. This was not a character he was playing. This was him. This was the truth of who he had become, captured for the entire world to see and to judge. He clicked the play button on the embedded video. It was shaky, filmed on a bystander's phone, but the audio was crystal clear. He heard his own voice, dripping with disdain, yelling those fateful words, "Do you know who I am?" He watched himself posture and rage while, just out of frame, a life hung in the balance. He felt a profound sense of self-loathing, a disgust so deep it was almost paralyzing. The man in that video was a monster, a caricature of everything he secretly feared he had become. Seeing it played back was like looking into a cursed mirror. As if on cue, the silent television in the corner of the waiting room flickered to life with a breaking news segment. And there, it was his own enraged face filling the screen, the viral video playing on a national news channel. David, who had been staring at the floor, looked up at the sound. He saw the video. He saw Julian's face on the screen, and then his eyes slowly, deliberately, moved to meet the real Julian's across the room. The suspicion in his gaze hardened into something else, cold, unforgiving contempt. In that moment, Julian was no longer just an intruder. He was the villain of the story. There was nothing to say. No apology could erase the ugliness of that moment. The evidence was absolute, broadcast for the world and for this grieving father to see. Julian felt stripped bare, his every flaw exposed under the harsh glare of the hospital lights and the judgmental eye of the camera. All the scripted apologies in the world couldn't fix this. The problem wasn't the bad press. The problem was his own character. He had built a life on a foundation of sand, and now the tide of reality was coming in, washing it all away. His phone buzzed again. It was Robert, his agent. This time, with a sense of grim resignation, Julian answered. "Julian, thank God. Where are you?" Robert's voice was a high-pitched squeak of panic. "The studio is freaking out. The morality clause. We have to get ahead of this. Claire has a statement ready. We'll say you were under extreme stress, personal issues. You didn't see the girl. We can spin this. We can fix this." The rapid-fire damage control was so familiar, a well-oiled machine designed to protect the brand, the asset, the corporation known as Julian Croft. Julian listened to the proposed apology, a carefully crafted piece of corporate fiction. It was full of phrases like sincere regret and a profound misunderstanding. It was a masterpiece of non-accountability, designed to smooth things over and make the problem disappear. It had nothing to do with the little girl fighting for her life in the next room. It had nothing to do with the profound ugliness he had displayed. It was just another lie, another layer of artifice in a life that had become suffocatingly fake. It was the voice of the man he no longer wanted to be. Without a word, he ended the call, leaving his agent sputtering in disbelief on the other end. He silenced his phone and put it in his pocket. He was done running. He was done hiding behind statements and publicists. The path forward wasn't going to be about saving his career. It was going to be about seeing if there was a man worth saving underneath it all. The first step was to stop acting. For the first time in years, he had no script, no director, and no idea what to do next. The feeling was both terrifying and strangely liberating. He stood up, not to leave, but to act, not as a celebrity, but as a person. He walked out of the waiting room, past the questioning glances of the nursing staff, and made his way down to the hospital's all-night cafeteria. The fluorescent lights hummed over rows of sad-looking sandwiches and stale pastries. It was a place of quiet desperation, a fuel stop for the worried and the weary. He wasn't hungry, but he knew Maya's parents must be, even if they didn't realize it themselves. He returned a few minutes later with 2 cups of coffee and 2 wrapped sandwiches. He approached the couple's small island of grief and, without a word, placed the items on the small table beside them. It was a simple, clumsy gesture, a silent offering that said what words could not. He didn't expect a response, and he didn't get one. He simply retreated to his corner, having done the one small, human thing he could think to do. It wasn't a solution, but it was an act of service, however minor. For a long time, the food and coffee sat untouched, a symbol of the chasm between them. Julian watched them, not with pity, but with a growing sense of respect. He saw their resilience, their unwavering focus on each other and their daughter. Then, after another hour had passed, David, his body slumped with exhaustion, finally reached out and took one of the coffees. He took a slow, deliberate sip. He didn't look at Julian. He didn't say thank you, but the gesture was enough. It was a tiny crack in the wall of his anger, a flicker of acknowledgement. Julian returned the next day, and the day after that. He had his assistant cancel every meeting, every appointment, every obligation for the foreseeable future. His agent was apoplectic. His publicist had all but given up on him, but Julian didn't care. He spent his days in the hard plastic chair in the corner of the waiting room, a silent, constant presence. He read scripts without seeing the words. His mind focused solely on the small dramas unfolding in the room, a nurse's update, a doctor's brief appearance, the changing expressions on the parents' faces. He was learning to be present. It was on the 3rd day that Maria finally spoke to him directly. Her anger seemed to have been worn down by exhaustion and fear, leaving only a mother's profound need to talk about her child, to make her real to this stranger. "She loves to draw," she said, her voice soft and hoarse. She was looking at Julian, but her eyes were seeing something far away. Stars and planets. Her whole bedroom ceiling is covered in glow in the dark stars. She says it's like sleeping in a spaceship. She was giving him a gift, a small window into the soul of the daughter he had almost wronged. For the first time, Julian didn't try to offer a solution or an apology. He simply listened. He let her words fill the sterile space, picturing the little girl in her celestial bedroom. He asked a question, a simple, genuine question that came not from a script, but from his own nascent curiosity. What's her favorite planet? The question was so small, so normal, but in the context of their strained vigil, it was monumental. It was an acknowledgement of Maya as a person, not just a patient or a victim. A tiny, fleeting smile touched Maria's lips, the first he had seen. "Saturn," she said, her voice filled with a sad warmth. "She loves it because of the rings. She calls them the planet's halo. She says it looks like an angel." The image was so pure, so innocent, that it pierced Julian's heart. He saw the world through a child's eyes for a moment, a world of wonder and magic, a world so far removed from his own cynical, transactional existence. This little girl, fighting for her life, was more alive than he had been in years. Feeling an uncharacteristic urge to connect, to share a piece of his own brokenness, Julian offered a fragment of his past. "My sister," he said, his voice quiet. "She liked to draw too." He didn't elaborate. He didn't tell them her name or what happened. It wasn't the time to unload his own grief. It was just a small offering, a bridge built from a single, shared truth. He, too, knew what it was to love a little girl who drew. Maria met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw not suspicion, but a flicker of shared humanity, of a common, tragic understanding. Their fragile moment was interrupted by the arrival of a woman in a white coat, her expression serious and compassionate. She introduced herself as Dr. Evans, Maya's pediatric cardiologist. She asked them to sit, and Julian instinctively began to stand, to give them privacy, but David gestured for him to stay. It was a small but significant gesture of inclusion. Dr. Evans began to explain Maya's condition, her words a series of complex medical terms that painted a grim and terrifying picture of the tiny, flawed heart beating in Maya's chest. She explained that Maya had a rare and severe congenital defect known as hypoplastic left heart syndrome. Essentially, the left side of her heart was critically underdeveloped and could not pump blood effectively to the body. It was a miracle, Dr. Evans said, that Maya had survived this long without a diagnosis. She had been living on borrowed time since the day she was born, a ticking clock hidden inside her own small chest. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, the clinical explanation making the reality even more brutal. Dr. Evans then laid out the only viable path forward. It wasn't a cure, but a series of 3 highly complex, high-risk open-heart surgeries, starting with a procedure known as the Norwood. It was a medical marvel, a complete replumbing of the heart and its major arteries, a desperate and brilliant attempt to force the right side of the heart to do the work of the entire organ. The risks were immense, the recovery long and arduous, and it required a surgical team with an incredibly rare and specific set of skills. Then came the final, devastating blow. Dr. Evans, with a look of profound sympathy, began to discuss the financial aspect. "This is an extremely specialized and costly series of procedures," she said gently. "With the surgery, the lengthy ICU stay, and the years of follow-up care, we are estimating the total cost will likely exceed $2 million. The number fell into the silent room like a boulder, shattering the last remnants of hope. It was an astronomical, impossible sum, a figure that represented a different reality entirely. David's face, already pale with worry, seemed to crumble. He let out a choked sound and revealed the final piece of the nightmare. "We already received a preliminary notification from our insurance provider," he said, his voice thick with a mixture of despair and fury. "They are denying coverage. They've classified the Norwood procedure as experimental for her specific case, and the recommended surgeon is out of network." It was the cruel, impersonal logic of bureaucracy, a death sentence delivered by a clerk in a distant office, a life reduced to a line item and a denial code. The despair in the room became a physical presence, a suffocating weight that pressed down on all of them. Maria's quiet weeping turned into deep, shuddering sobs. David buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the helplessness of a father who had moved mountains for his child, but was being stopped by a mountain of paperwork. All their love, all their strength, all their prayers were crashing against the unyielding wall of a broken system. Hope, which had been a flickering candle in the dark, was finally extinguished. Julian watched them, and in their utter devastation, he saw the ultimate indictment of his own life. What was the point of his fortune, of his private jets and sprawling mansions, if it couldn't be used to fight this kind of obscene injustice? The last walls of his detachment, of his fear of getting involved, crumbled into dust. He saw the ghost of his sister, Sarah, standing beside him, her presence a silent, urgent plea. He couldn't save her then, but the universe, in its cruel and mysterious way, had just given him a second chance. A cold fear gripped him, the terrifying, familiar fear of loss, of caring for someone only to watch them be taken away. It was the wound he had spent his entire adult life trying to cauterize with fame and money. But as he looked at the broken forms of Maria and David, a new feeling surged through him, one that was stronger than the fear. It was a righteous anger, a profound sense of purpose. He knew, with a clarity that was both terrifying and exhilarating, what he had to do. His life of playing heroes was over. It was time to try to be one. A profound and heavy silence descended upon the waiting room in the wake of Dr. Evans's departure. The $2 million figure seemed to hang in the air, a malevolent ghost sucking all the oxygen from the room. Maria and David were no longer crying. They had moved past tears into a state of numb, hollowed-out shock. They sat huddled together, but they looked utterly alone, adrift in a sea of impossible choices and bureaucratic cruelty. The quiet hum of the hospital was the only sound, a stark and indifferent witness to the complete devastation of a family's hope. Julian felt the immense gravity of the moment, a silence more profound than any he had ever experienced on a soundstage. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, wild rhythm in the stillness of the room. This was it. There were no cameras, no script, no director to yell, "Cut," if he failed. This was the most important scene of his life, and the stakes were real, tangible, and terrifyingly high. He knew that what he did next would define him, not in the eyes of the public, but in his own. He had to shed the last vestiges of the actor, the celebrity, the brand, and speak from the broken, buried core of the man he was. He took a slow, deliberate breath, steadying himself for the terrifying plunge into complete, unvarnished honesty. He moved his hard plastic chair closer to them, the scraping sound loud in the quiet room. He didn't sit opposite them, like a negotiator, but beside them, creating a small circle, a fragile alliance against the world. He leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees, and looked at the floor. He didn't start with the money. That had been his first catastrophic mistake. He began with a confession, his voice barely a raw whisper, words he had never before spoken aloud to another living soul. "I haven't told anyone this story," he began, "not in 20 years. Not my agent, not my friends, not anyone. I had a sister," he said, the words feeling foreign and painful on his tongue. "Her name was Sarah. She was brilliant, funnier than me, smarter than me. She had this crooked little smile when she was telling a lie. She loved to draw animals, hundreds of them, and she gave them all these ridiculous, formal names like Sir Reginald the Squirrel. He wasn't just talking about a tragedy. He was resurrecting a person, painting a picture of the vibrant life that had been lost, making her real for them so they could understand the depth of the wound he carried, the ghost that haunted his every waking moment." His voice grew thicker with emotion as he forced himself to walk back through the minefield of his memory. That whole year, my first big movie was coming out. I was consumed by it, by myself. I was so wrapped up in the premieres and the interviews that when my parents would call, worried about her, about a fever that wouldn't break, I treated it like an interruption, a background noise to the symphony of my own success. I was an idiot. I was a child playing at being a king, and I was completely blind to what was real, to what actually mattered in the world. He paused, the memory of his greatest shame a burning coal in his throat. "The night of the premiere in Los Angeles," he continued, his voice cracking, "my mother called me. She was scared. I remember being annoyed that she was interrupting me while I was getting dressed. I told her I was sure it was nothing and that I'd call her the next day. I chose a tuxedo over my sister. I chose the flash of cameras and the roar of a crowd over my family. I stood on that red carpet feeling like the most important man in the world, while my little sister was dying. The carefully constructed dam of his composure finally broke. Tears he had suppressed for 2 decades began to stream down his face, hot and shameful. I was in the middle of an interview, talking about some stupid stunt I'd done, when my father called to tell me she was gone. The world it ended. But it didn't. The party kept going. The people kept smiling. And I had to stand there, in that whirlwind of absolute phoniness, with the single most real and horrible truth I would ever know. I didn't get to say goodbye. I didn't get to tell her I was sorry. He finally lifted his head, his eyes meeting theirs, his face stripped bare of all artifice. It was a mask of pure, unadulterated pain. "When I got out of my car today," he said, his voice ragged, "and I saw Officer Miller on the ground, and I saw Maya. That anger that came out of me, that horrible, ugly arrogance. It wasn't about the traffic. I swear to you it wasn't. It was about seeing it all happen again. That same feeling of complete and utter helplessness. Seeing a child in trouble and feeling that old, familiar uselessness rushing back in." He took a shaky breath, the confession pouring out of him now. Yelling at that officer was a deflection. It was a coward's way of feeling powerful in a moment where I felt completely powerless. It was easier to be angry, to be a monster, than to face the terror that another child might be lost while I just stood by and watched. It was easier to scream, "Don't you know who I am?" than to admit to myself that in the moments that truly matter, I am nobody. I am just a frightened man who failed his own sister. The raw, brutal honesty of his confession hung in the air, changing the very atmosphere of the room. It was not an apology. It was a testament, a bearing of a soul. In that moment of complete vulnerability, the walls between them dissolved. Maria and David were no longer looking at Julian Croft, the untouchable Hollywood icon from the news report. They were looking at a man shattered by a grief that mirrored their own terror, a man who understood the unique agony of being powerless to protect someone you love more than life itself. They saw his humanity, and in it, they recognized their own. Having finally spoken his deepest truth, Julian felt a strange sense of peace settle over him, a quiet calm in the eye of the emotional storm. He had unburdened himself of the secret that had poisoned his life for 2 decades. He was more exposed and vulnerable than he had ever been, on screen or off, but he also felt, for the first time, clean. The guilt was still there, a permanent scar on his soul, but it was no longer a weapon he used against himself. It was simply a part of his story, a story he had finally found the courage to tell. He straightened up slightly in his chair, his gaze locking with David's. The power dynamic between them, celebrity and civilian, rich and poor, was gone, incinerated in the fire of his confession. In this small, sterile room, they were equals, 2 men bound together by a shared understanding of love, fear, and the specter of loss. One was fighting to prevent a tragedy, the other was desperate to atone for one. Julian knew that everything he had, everything he had ever earned, had led him to this single, pivotal moment. "Let me help," he said again, but this time the words were different. They were not an offer of charity, but a plea for redemption. His voice was low, steady, and filled with a conviction that had been absent before. "Please, I am not doing this for the press. I'm not doing it to save my career. To be honest, my career is probably over after this, and I've realized I don't care. It means nothing. None of it does." This was the truth, a truth he had only just discovered but now believed with every fiber of his being. He leaned in, his sincerity a palpable force in the room. He was making a vow. "I am doing this for your daughter," he said, his voice softening as he spoke her name, "for Maya. And I am doing this for my sister, to honor her memory. To do the one thing for your little girl that I was too stupid and selfish and scared to do for her." The purpose was so clear now, so pure. This wasn't about erasing his guilt. It was about transforming it into something good, something that could create life, instead of just mourning it. He laid it all out, a promise delivered with the weight of a lifetime of regret. "The $2 million for the surgery," he said, the number no longer feeling like an insurmountable obstacle, but a simple tool. "The best surgical team in the country will fly them here or fly her to them. A place for you to live, so you can be by her side through all of it, every single thing she needs for her recovery. It's all taken care of. It's done. You just have to let me do this. You just have to say yes. Please, let me do this one good thing with my life." There was no grand, dramatic reaction. There was no cinematic swell of music. There was only a profound, sacred quiet. The parents looked at each other, a silent conversation passing between them, a lifetime of love and trust compressed into a single glance. Then Maria slowly reached out across the small space between their chairs and took Julian's hand in both of hers. Her touch was warm and steady. David, his face wet with tears, simply looked at Julian and nodded, a single, slow, deliberate gesture of acceptance and gratitude. The bond was forged, not in a contract, but in shared pain and a fragile, newfound hope. The day of the surgery was a masterpiece of controlled, silent tension. Julian sat with Maria and David in a private waiting room he had arranged, the 3 of them a small, unified island in a sea of anxiety. For 9 excruciating hours, they subsisted on stale coffee and shared hope, speaking little but communicating volumes in their shared glances and paced steps. The sterile quiet of the hospital seemed to amplify every fear, every worst-case scenario. When Dr. Evans finally appeared in the doorway, her surgical scrubs still on, her face tired but illuminated by a small, brilliant smile, the collective breath they had been holding was released in a single, shuddering wave. "The procedure went perfectly," she announced. "Maya is a fighter. She's in recovery now. The relief was so absolute, so overwhelming, it was a physical force, bringing Maria and David to their knees in grateful tears. Julian did not leave. In the days and weeks that followed, he became a permanent fixture at the hospital, his world shrinking to the size of Maya's recovery room. He canceled 2 film projects, fired his publicist when she suggested a hospital photoshoot for PR, and ignored the frantic calls from his agent. He spent his days reading, not scripts, but medical journals about Maya's condition, determined to understand every nuance of her fight. He was a quiet presence in the corner of the room, a guardian watching over this small girl, his fame and fortune feeling like irrelevant artifacts from another man's life. He was simply Julian, a man keeping a promise to a sister he had lost, and to a little girl he was determined not to fail. When Maya was finally lucid enough for visitors, he entered her room with a palpable nervousness that far exceeded any opening night jitters. She was small and pale amidst the web of tubes and monitors, but her wide brown eyes were full of a clear, bright curiosity. She looked at the famous movie star and saw only a tall man with kind, sad eyes. He brought with him a book, a beautifully illustrated copy of Cosmos, and began to read to her about nebulas and galaxies. He pointed to the picture of Saturn. "I hear this one is your favorite," he said softly. A tiny, weak smile graced her lips, and in that small, simple connection, a genuine, powerful bond was forged. He quickly became Uncle Julian. He was the one who knew how to make her laugh with silly voices when he read, the one who smuggled in her favorite grape popsicle when the nurses weren't looking. He spent his evenings sharing quiet, simple meals with Maria and David in the hospital cafeteria, their conversation shifting from Maya's medical charts to stories of their childhoods, their dreams, their ordinary lives. They were an unlikely family, forged in the crucible of crisis and cemented by an act of profound compassion. Julian, who had lived a life of gilded solitude, was finally learning the simple, beautiful language of human connection. The emptiness inside him was slowly being filled. Weeks later, a healthier Maya by his side, Julian finally faced the world. He called a press conference, but it was on his own terms. He stood at a simple podium, not in a designer suit, but in a plain gray t-shirt and jeans. The man who faced the blinding wall of camera flashes was not the arrogant celebrity from the viral video. His face was leaner, etched with the fatigue of hospital vigils, but his eyes were clear and steady. He looked peaceful, a man who had finally shed a heavy, ill-fitting costume and was comfortable in his own skin for the very first time. He didn't make excuses or offer a publicist-penned apology. He took full, unflinching ownership of his past actions. "The man you saw in that video on Rodeo Drive," he began, his voice even and calm, was a caricature. He was an empty, frightened man who confused his net worth with his self-worth. "I am deeply ashamed of him. There are no excuses for his behavior." He paused, looking directly into the cameras. "I owe my life to Maya Flores and her parents. They were faced with a nightmare, and they showed me what real strength, grace, and courage look like. They saved me from the man I was becoming." Then he unveiled his new purpose. What happened to Maya is not just a personal tragedy. It's a systemic failure, he declared, his voice ringing with conviction. A family's financial status should never determine whether their child lives or dies. To that end, today I am announcing the formation of the Maya Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to funding emergency and life-saving medical procedures for children who are denied by insurance companies. He announced an initial endowment of $50 million of his own money, a figure that sent a shocked murmur through the press corps. He wasn't just apologizing, he was acting. He was turning his pain and his privilege into a legacy. 5 years later, the ballroom of the Beverly Hilton was filled with elegant guests and the warm sound of chatter, not for a movie premiere, but for the 5th annual Maya Foundation fundraising gala. At a table near the stage, a genuinely smiling Julian Croft, his face softer and lined with authentic laughter, sat beside his close friend, Officer Miller, who now served on the foundation's board of directors. Their journey, which began with a hostile confrontation on a hot street, had come full circle, transformed into a partnership built on mutual respect and a shared mission. They were no longer symbols of conflict, but of reconciliation and hope. The lights dimmed, and a spotlight found the woman on stage, a healthy, vibrant 13-year-old Maya Flores. She stood at the podium with the poise and confidence of a girl who knew her own worth. She spoke eloquently about her own journey, not as a victim, but as a survivor, her story a powerful testament to the Foundation's mission. Julian watched her, his eyes glistening with a pride so profound it dwarfed any professional achievement he had ever known. This was his blockbuster. This was his Oscar. This beautiful, thriving young woman was his greatest work. Maya concluded her speech, her voice clear and strong. "My story has a happy ending because of a second chance," she said. "And the whole purpose of this foundation is to pay that chance forward." She then gestured to the side of the stage. "So tonight, I'd like you to meet the Johnson family, whose 7-year-old son, Leo, had his successful heart transplant funded by all of you last month." As the family walked onto the stage to thunderous applause, the camera found Julian's face. He was watching the cycle of compassion continue, a beautiful, powerful ripple effect born from a single moment of humility on a Beverly Hills sidewalk. He was a man who had finally found his own life, not by playing a hero, but by choosing to become one. Do you believe that one single act of compassion can change the world? Leave a little heart if you believe love is more powerful than any wealth. Subscribe for more second chance stories. Comment love is priceless if you also believe in human kindness.